Hey, BHH and NC here, spectating and speculating about finding grace in America in these times. Welcome aboard.
9. At the climax of the inauguration of worship in the wilderness. After months of preparation, the tabernacle was finally erected, the Levitical priesthood consecrated, and the people gathered to witness something unprecedented, the first day of official sacrifices under Aaron's leadership. Picture the scene. The altar was ready, incense rising in a sweet aroma, burnt offerings being offered according to every detail God had commanded. And at the end of that day, something extraordinary happened. In Leviticus 9:24, we read that, "There came a fire out from before the Lord, and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat, which when all the people saw, they shouted and fell on their faces." Have you ever stopped to think about that? God himself sent consuming fire from heaven to ignite the altar, as a public sign of his approval. This was the most glorious moment Israel had experienced since Sinai. The glory of God filled the place, the people fell on their faces in worship, and the atmosphere was one of reverent awe. This detail is crucial to understanding what follows. The story of Nadab and Abihu happens right after this divine act of approval. In other words, they went from the highest privilege of seeing God's fire fall to becoming an example of God's judgment, all in the same context. Do you feel the tension this creates? The day that began with celebration and worship would end in tragedy. The message is clear. The presence of God is glorious, but also holy. The same fire that blesses can also judge. And it is in this very atmosphere of glory and fear that Nadab and Abihu decide to act on their own. And then it happens. In the middle of that atmosphere of glory and reverence, Nadab and Abihu step in with their censers. Leviticus 10:1 says, "And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer, and put fire therein, and put incense thereon, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not." Ayesh Zara. Here is the breaking point. They offer strange fire. In Hebrew, Ayesh Zara. Strange why? Because it was not the fire that God himself had kindled, it was not what he had commanded. It was fire from another source, an unauthorized act. In other words, they invented a ritual, maybe even intending to honor God, but outside of his divine pattern. Do you see the gravity of this? The very altar that had just been consecrated with heavenly fire was now being profaned by something human, improvised, perhaps even impure. Worship turned from true devotion to irreverence in seconds. And in the context of the Levitical priesthood, this wasn't just a liturgical mistake. It was a violation of God's own holiness. Now think about this. These men had seen the glory of God on Sinai, had seen God's fire fall on the altar just the day before, and still they acted on their own. Was it excessive zeal, spiritual arrogance, or perhaps a heart drunk, literally or figuratively, that had lost sobriety before the sacred? That question leads us to the next topic, because scholars to this day try to understand exactly what this strange fire was that cost Nadab and Abihu their lives, and the explanations are as intriguing as they are dramatic. What exactly did Nadab and Abihu do that caused God's judgment to fall so instantly? This is where centuries of biblical interpretation come into play. Scholars analyze every detail of Leviticus 10 and other passages to try to grasp the depth of their sin. The first hypothesis is the most literal. They used fire from the wrong source. Instead of taking fire from the altar, which had been lit by God himself, they used common fire. This is serious because the altar's fire represented God's presence, and using any other flame was symbolically a profanation of worship. It was as if they were trying to manufacture their own glory. Another interpretation is that they burned incense in the wrong place or at the wrong time. Some scholars suggest that they may have tried to enter the Holy of Holies without authorization, something reserved for the high priest only once a year. Leviticus 16:1-2 refers back to this episode as a warning. If that's the case, their sin was crossing the boundary of the holy presence without preparation, an act of deadly presumption. And then there's the most controversial hypothesis, priestly drunkenness. Right after their death, God commands that priests must not drink wine or strong drink when entering the tabernacle, Leviticus 10:8-9. Many take this as a clue that Nadab and Abihu were under the influence of alcohol, which would have impaired their discernment as they ministered. If true, this shows that their irreverence in worship was not just ritual, but heart-deep. They served without sobriety before God.
Hi, this is George from the Return of the King channel. This video is especially for my core audience, my regular viewers, those of you who've been with me since around 2020. The rapture itself is patterned after a Jewish wedding. A Jewish wedding lasted 7 days. Our wedding with Christ will last 7 years. Now, in a Jewish wedding, there was a period of time when no one knew the exact day or hour of the wedding, not even the groom's father. Here's how it worked. Once the couple was betrothed, they were legally married. The groom would then go to his father's house and build an addition for himself and his bride. It usually takes 1 to 2 years. It's been around 2,000 years since Christ's death and resurrection. Only after the addition was finished would the father give the go-ahead. That's when the date could be set. The Bible reflects this in the parable of the 10 virgins. In that story, everyone knows the day the groom is coming, the bride and the bridesmaids included. They even know roughly when because they know he's late. Normally, he would arrive around sunset, but in that parable, he doesn't arrive until midnight. Matthew 24:36, no one knows the day or the hour, is one of the most distorted and misused verses in all of Scripture. It doesn't mean we'll never know the day. It simply means that the setting of the day belongs to the Father. Nothing more, nothing less. When I first started out, my plan was simply to trust God and see where this would lead. It's only in these last few weeks that everything has come to be fully understood. In this video, I'm going to talk about 6 dreams that happened in 2020. I had 4 of them and my son had 2. What's amazing is that 4 of those dreams came on the very same night, 2 for him and 2 for me. All of them happened in 2020, 5 years ago. And in the Bible, 5 is the number of grace. At the rapture, the age of grace will come to an end. These dreams, as a whole, points to the Feast of Trumpets. On today's Jewish calendar, it begins at sunset on September 22nd and ends at sunset on September 24th. Now, originally in the Bible, it was just 1 day, but during the diaspora, when the Jewish people were scattered far from Jerusalem, it was stretched to 2 days. The reason was simple. When the crescent moon was sighted in Jerusalem, it could take a day for the message to reach those who live far away. So the feast became a 2-day celebration, and that tradition is still followed today. In Joshua's vision, Jesus said, on the 23rd and 24th of September 2025, I will come to take my church. Those dates line up exactly with today's Jewish calendar. And just the same, September 15th falls on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the day of Christ's return. Then Jesus said, on the 15th of September 2032, I will return to earth as king. Let's start by looking at the first dream. On September 29th, 2020, I published a video titled 2020 Rapture Almost Home. The dream I'm about to share came right after I prayed, Lord, if I don't get something from you soon, I'm going to quit doing these videos. It had been 3 years since the Revelation 12 sign, and we were still here. Honestly, I was burnt out. I told God, if you want me to keep going, I need something that shows me I'm on the right track. That night, September 22nd, 2020, at 4 a.m., I had this dream. Exactly 5 years to the start of the Feast of Trumpets 2025. A couple of weeks ago, I felt prompted to go back and find the exact date. I had forgotten when the dream had occurred, Suddenly, pieces of the dream that had always been a mystery started to fall into place. Every single detail of this dream matters. It confirms the year of Jubilee, and it points to the Feast of Trumpets as the Feast of the Rapture. In the dream, I was running a marathon, 26.2 miles. That number has meaning. 26 is the numerical value of the name of God in Hebrew, YHWH, Yahweh. At the end of the race, two groups meet with God, the dead in Christ and those of us who are alive and remain. The race was set in Egypt. Jesus told Joshua there would be 77 years to the Exodus. He used that word, but he was talking about the rapture. The Jubilee is 7 times 7 years, and then on the 50th year is the Jubilee. 2025 is a Jubilee year. The marathon took place near the pyramids. I wasn't running alone. I was with a Christian coworker named Steve. That name plays an important role in the credibility of this dream. When the dream begins, I was in the desert just south of the pyramids. Steve and I were nearing the end of the race, and I was ready to make the final push to finish strong. But when I looked at my sport watch, the one that carried the race map, it wasn't working. I spent a great deal of time trying to fix it, but nothing worked. I finally broke away from Steve and followed other runners into the city as we headed north. But once we got into the city, nothing was blocked off for the race. Without a map, you'd get lost, and I did. Inside the city, the race wound back and forth. Nothing was straight. I eventually came across a map posted on a sign. It had the usual marker, "You are here, and the finish is here." But the strange part was that the rest of the course formed a sharp V shape, and that's where the dream ended. I woke up knowing the V was symbolic, but I didn't know of what. At the time, I had read Tom Horn's book, Zenith 2016, and understood some of the connections between Egypt, America, and the coming of the Antichrist. But the dream itself, I had no idea what it meant. Over the years, God slowly revealed the meaning and timing, and just in the last few days, more has been revealed. So let's talk about that V. It had always been the biggest mystery. Why was the last section of the race shaped like a V? Why was I at this specific point on it? I speculated about it in my earlier videos, and someone commented that it reminded them of the V in Pisces. As it turned out, they were right, but there's more to it. I was given that dream on September 22nd, 2020, and exactly 5 years later, to the day, the Feast of Trumpets begins at sunset on September 22nd. In Roman numerals, the value of V is 5. And in the dream, when I woke up, I found myself at the top of this side of the V. That's like a double confirmation. The V itself points to 5 years until we meet with God at the end of the race. Now remember, the marathon was 26.2 miles. 26 is the numerical value of the name of God, YHWH in Hebrew. And at the end of the race, just like at the rapture, there are two groups who meet with Jesus, the dead in Christ and those of us who are alive. At that moment, the age of grace comes to a close, and God's focus turns back to Israel. The tribulation is the time of Jacob's trouble, not the church's. From the very day the dream was given, it's 5 years exactly to the start of the Feast of Trumpets. And biblically, 5 is the number of grace. The age of grace, the church age, ends at the rapture. But here's something else. I wasn't running alone. I was running with a Christian coworker named Steve. That name matters. The name Stephen comes from the Greek word Stephanos, which means crown. In Revelation 4:10, when believers stand before the throne, we cast our crowns, our Stephanos, before God. The V in the dream is also connected to the constellation of the Christian Pisces. I overlay the map on Pisces, and it seems to make sense. I then begin to read about these constellations in Joseph Zeiss's book, The Gospel in the Stars. The constellations of the rapture are Aries, in Hebrew Tale, which means the Lamb. The fish, the symbol of the Christian, and Cetus, the red dragon. The constellations of the tribulation are Taurus, Christ the judge, Gemini, the heavenly wedding, Christ and his bride. The bride in Revelation chapter 12 is the male child, and then Cancer representing heaven. And then I noticed that it takes the moon 7 days to travel from Aries to Cancer heaven. So I asked the Lord, does the moon in the constellation of Aries have anything to do with the rapture? That night I get a dream symbolizing our heavenly wedding. So yes, the moon in Aries will have something to do with the rapture. When I overlay the map, I place the finish to the race here on the ecliptic, the line you see here. The ecliptic is defined by the path of the sun. The planets and the moon stay very close to this line most of the time. So having the finish to the race here at this location makes sense. The eclipse of April 8th, 2024 appears exactly on the band of the fish at the finish line of the race. 3 days later, the moon will be in the constellation of the Lamb. At Mount Sinai, the Israelites were given 3 days to prepare to meet with God. You just had the Exodus, and now they will meet with God, a foreshadowing of the rapture. At this time, the interpretation of the dreams makes sense. It's close, but it's not the fulfillment of the dream. In late fall of 2024, I thought the journey was over. There's nothing more. The signs in the heavens are done. Now we just wait. Could be any day. While I was making what I thought would be my final video, I kept coming back to one particular day. I told myself, if something appears right here, at the intersection of the ecliptic and this band of the fish, then everything will make sense. On that day, Mars, the symbol of the red dragon, was in Gemini, the constellation tied to the wedding. Jupiter was between the horns of Taurus, and the moon was in Aries, fulfilling Dream 2. Saturn hovered over the dragon's tail, the tail that casts a third of the stars to Earth. And Venus sat atop the V on the right, just like in the dream. But for some reason, I couldn't see it. In my head, I expected it to show up somewhere else, here. I checked that day again and again, 6 or 7 times over 2 weeks, until finally, suddenly, I saw it. This is how the map I was shown in the dream connects with the constellation of Pisces. The V begins and ends at the heads of the 2 fish. The fulfillment is so exact that on the day before, Venus is just to the left of the top of the V, and on the day after, it's just to the right. That kind of precision tells me something. These 2 dreams, fulfilled on the very first day of the year that marks the Jubilee, confirm that this is indeed the year of Jubilee. The tribulation has to begin in a Jubilee year. And notice this, it's exactly 7 months to the Feast of Trumpets. In the Bible, 7 is the number of completion. In Revelation, Jesus calls himself the bright morning star. At the rapture, at the end of the 26.2-mile race, it is the bright morning star, Jesus himself, whom we will meet in the air. Above the dragon's tail is Saturn, symbolic of Satan and the angels who will be cast out of heaven and thrown to the earth. The moon, symbolic of Jesus, is in the constellation of the Lamb. That fulfills the second dream, the moon appearing in Aries. From there it takes the moon 7 days to reach Cancer, the sign of heaven. And just like a Jewish wedding lasts 7 days, so we will be with Christ in heaven for 7 years. Jupiter, representing Christ, is between the horns of Taurus, the judge, who will bring judgment to the earth after he takes his bride home. And Mars, the symbol of the red dragon, is in the constellation of the wedding. In Revelation chapter 12, the dragon tries to stop the wedding from happening, but the male child, Christ and his bride, are caught up, raptured, snatched away to God and his throne. On today's Jewish calendar, the Feast of Trumpets 2025 begins at sunset on September 22nd and ends at sunset on the 24th. At sunset on the 24th, the heavens look like this. Venus, the bright morning star, stands in the constellation of the Lion of the tribe of Judah. In Revelation, Jesus says he's the bright morning star. It is Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who is worthy to open the scroll and its 7 seals. That opening begins the tribulation. Mars, the symbol of the red dragon, is here, exactly where you'd expect, to devour the child when it's born. And now 3-Eye Atlas has appeared. A third of the angels cast out of heaven, here with the dragon, ready to devour the male child. Timothy Alberino in Birthright. argues that Mars was once the domain of the red dragon, Satan. Revelation 12:4. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. So here it is, Mars, the red dragon, with three-eye Atlas, on the eve of the Jubilee year and the tribulation, waiting to devour the child. But there's a problem. When the Revelation 12 sign completed in 2017, Jupiter representing the child was here. But in 2025, Jupiter isn't here, it's here. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up, harpazo, raptured to God and his throne. Gemini represents our heavenly wedding, which begins with the rapture. The two figures are twin brothers. One represents Christ based on the principal star in his head, Pollux, meaning ruler, the judge. The other figure symbolizes the bride of Christ. In Revelation 12, the bride of Christ is symbolized by the male child. At the rapture, Christ descends from heaven and snatches us away from the dragon. The story of our escape began on September 23, 2017, when Jupiter, the male child, emerged from Virgo's womb. 8 years later, just before the tribulation, the red dragon, Mars, is in position to devour the male child, and with him the third of the angels, cast out of heaven by his tail. But the dragon fails. He cannot stop the rapture. If he could, Christ could not bring judgment, and Satan could keep his rule. But the heavens on the Feast of Trumpets 2025 declare victory over the dragon. It matches Revelation 12:5. Jupiter is now in Gemini, the constellation of the wedding. Jewish weddings begin when the bridegroom comes and snatches the bride to the wedding chamber. That is the story written in the heavens. Our escape, when Christ descends and snatches us from the dragon. He takes us to God and his throne, to heaven, the wedding chamber. At the time of Christ, a Jewish wedding lasted 7 days. We will be with Christ in heaven for 7 years. The story in the heavens of our escape from the dragon, the rapture, is picture perfect on the Feast of Trumpets.